I call the member for Fenner.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Suppose for just a moment that the 10 minutes allocated for this speech was distributed as unequally as Australian wealth. If that was true, I'd spend the first 6 minutes 13 seconds talking about the richest fifth, then 2 minutes and 3 speaking about the next fifth, just 1 minute and 8 seconds speaking about Middle Australia, 31 seconds speaking about the second bottom fifth, and the last 5 seconds speaking about the poorest. In short, Deputy Speaker, it'd sound an awful lot like the typical Liberal speech. This is a government that says it fights for freedoms, but the problem is the sort of freedoms they fight for are not the freedoms ordinary Australians care about. They fight for the freedom to stash your cash in a tax haven, the freedom for big banks to avoid a royal commission, the freedom to buy a negatively geared home for your 1-year-old baby, the freedom to deduct a $6,000 toaster, the freedom to be named in the Panama Papers. Deputy Speaker, plutocratic politics is on the rise. We on this side of the House thought it was pretty bad when John Howard said he wouldn't move into the Lodge. Now we have a Prime Minister who's too good to move into Kirribilli House. And yet he lectures us about elites. Let's face it, being lectured about elites by this Prime Minister is like being lectured about sportsmanship by John McEnroe, about abstinence by Ozzy Osbourne, about driver safety by Troy Buswell, or about loyalty by the member for by the Treasurer. This is a government that never takes responsibility. You know, when Adam and Eve were caught in the Garden of Eden, the Liberals sent around talking points saying it was all Labor's fault. And if only we'd supported a company tax cut, the serpent wouldn't have got there at all. This is the side of politics who cuts the wages of the people who clean their offices, while fighting tooth and jowl against closing multinational tax loopholes. They're a group who don't want Cabinet to sit on the Sunday, who don't open their electorate offices on a Sunday, but who want to cut the penalty rates for workers who work on a Sunday. They just don't realise how the other half live. I was in the suburb of Ravenwood with a member for Bass last week. It's a suburb where the average income is $32,000. Not individual income, household income, where the unemployment rate is 16%, and where those opposite don't visit and don't care. And it's not just in Ravenswood where Australians are hurting. Low-income Australians live 7 years less than affluent Australians. They have on average 7 fewer teeth. We're coming up on Christmas, and according to surveys, 1 in 20 Australian families say they can't afford to buy Christmas presents for their friends and family. We're in Australia where most categories of crime have fallen over recent decades, and yet the share of Australians behind bars today is the highest it's been since 1901. Now, some of the other speakers in this MPI are going to focus on the rise in inequality, but I do want to note that that's showing up in unexpected places in the United States, a country where now the top 0.1% have a larger share of income than the bottom 90%, and where life expectancy for white working-class women has actually been falling over recent years, a phenomenon that Angus Deaton and Anne Case call deaths of despair. And I commend the Shadow Minister for Finance for his detailed analysis of how Australia could walk down that road. Australia has a great egalitarian tradition, and as the Leader of the Opposition has pointed out, it's Labor that's defending not just our tradition but that of the nation. We're a country that doesn't much like tipping. We prefer to pay a good wage, where many of us will sit in the front seat of taxis, where you can't buy a private area on the beach. That's the Australian way. And when in 2009, with leadership from the member for Lilley and the member for Jagga Jagga, Labor raised the pension and brought 1 million Australians out of poverty, we weren't just fighting for working Australians and for low-income Australians, we were fighting for the Australian way of life. The great egalitarian tradition of Eureka, of Curtin, of Lawson, of Lingiari. Part of that tradition, Deputy Speaker, is our great trade union movement. Unions aren't just the organisation that brought you sick leave, the 8-hour day and the weekend. they're also the strongest bulwark we have against rising inequality. Indeed, about a third of the rise of inequality we've seen over recent decades has been caused by the declining union membership share. Now, I need to be clear, Deputy Speaker, Labor has no tolerance for corruption, whether we're seeing it from mining companies, construction companies or former Liberal Party directors. But we on this side of the House understand that unions have played a critical role in egalitarianism. It's unions that fight for dollar pay increases, for pay equity across the workforce, for pay equity for women in the workforce and for Indigenous Australians. The tax case recognised that women had been systematically underpaid in feminised occupations, and it's unions that are arguing for gender pay equality. If you're against unions as a whole, then you're on the side of the billionaires, not the side of the battlers. Inequality, Deputy Speaker, is fundamental to so much of what we do in this place. If we don't tackle inequality, we're not going to close the gender pay gap, which has stubbornly failed to close for a generation. If you believe in closing the gaps, as all of us in this place do, then you have to recognise that one of the reasons why Indigenous, non-Indigenous gaps have stayed stubbornly wide is rising earnings inequality in Australia. And if you want to increase the home ownership rate, which is now at a 60-year low, then you have to care about inequality. And no, the solution is not that wealthy parents should shell out to help their kids get a home. If you believe in closing the opportunity gap, if you believe that the postcode into which you're born shouldn't determine your life chances, then you need to care about inequality. Because in Australia, where the gaps between the rungs are widening, is an Australia where it becomes harder and harder to climb up and down the ladder of opportunity over the course of a lifetime. As the Shadow Treasurer pointed out in his address this week on the case for opportunity, new estimates on social mobility show the problem is worse than we thought, that intergenerational mobility in Australia is lower than had previously been thought. And part of the reason for that is rising inequality. In the United States, it's the unequal places that are the immobile places, where people who don't have a chance to move up the ladder as a result of inequality. I hear those opposite saying, "Oh, it's just the United States," as though there's nothing wrong with Australia going down the United States road. But if you look across the world, you see systematically that countries with more inequality are countries with less mobility. If you believe in the maxim that any kid, regardless of his and her background, should be able to make it, then you have to believe in egalitarianism. We believe in that Australian value on this side of the House. That's why we're standing up for the Australian values of home ownership, of the right to be rewarded for working on weekends. It's why we on this side of the House believe in egalitarian funding of schools, in providing equality of opportunity through our school funding. It's why we stood against the government's GP tax, and it's why we have consistently stood for a fair taxation system. In July of next year, this government is going to bring down a tax cut for those earning over $180,000 a year. Everyone in this House will be a beneficiary of that tax cut, but that's because many of us in this House sit in just the top couple of percent of the Australian income distribution. Indeed, 94% of the benefits of that tax cut are going to go to the top 1%, a group that has doubled their share of national income over the course of the last generation. The top 1% of Australia doesn't need yet another tax cut from the Turnbull government. But there is one area in which the Turnbull government has given us more equality. Since the member for Wentworth became Prime Minister, we've seen more equality in this House. When the member for Wentworth became Prime Minister, there was a lot of inequality, a lot of people over that side, fewer people over this side. But since the member for Wentworth has become Prime Minister, the numbers in this House are a lot more equal. And it's not just the numbers in this House, it's the votes as well. For the first time in 50 years, we're seeing a bit of equality A few people on there, a few votes on this House coming on the member for this side. Equality, it's a great Australian value and you can't keep it down.
Before I call the Assistant Minister for Immigration and Border Protector, I should remind people that the MPI is not a team